Hey guys, welcome back to the Sleep Atlas. Tonight we're taking on a story so massive, so sprawling that honestly it feels impossible to fit into a single video. But that's exactly why we're doing it. Because if there's one thing that makes history both fascinating and a little absurd, it's the Roman Empire. The empire that everyone thinks they know, but very few actually understand beyond a vague image of Julius Caesar shouting "Et tu, Brute?" and Russell Crowe looking heroic in a leather skirt. Let's be clear, the Roman Empire wasn't supposed to exist. It started as a tiny cluster of huts on the banks of the Tiber River. Not marble palaces, not sweeping armies, just mud huts. And yet, somehow, this insignificant little community turned into the greatest empire the world has ever seen. That's the paradox. How on earth did that happen? Now, before we dive in, take a moment, get comfortable, maybe dim the lights or pull your blanket up a little higher. And while you're here, let me ask, what's keeping you up tonight? Let me know down in the comments. I always love hearing where you're listening from and what's on your mind. And if you enjoy journeys like this, history that's told in a way that helps you relax, please subscribe. That way you'll always have another story waiting for you the next time you need to rest. Alright, let's step back, way back, into the earliest days of Rome. Chapter 1. From mud huts to world power. Picture it, central Italy around 753 BCE. You wouldn't recognize it as Rome. There's no Colosseum, no Senate, no aqueducts arching gracefully across the hills. Instead, you'd see a collection of huts with thatched roofs perched along a bend in the Tiber River. The smell of damp straw, wood smoke, and mud would hang in the air. Chickens scratching in the dirt, dogs barking, people hauling water from the river. This was the humble origin of what would eventually become the Roman Empire. It's almost comical, isn't it? The people who would one day rule most of Europe and the Mediterranean, who would build marble temples and roads that outlasted empires, began with huts that would barely impress a village in Minecraft. And yet here's the thing. Sometimes the greatest stories don't start with grandeur. They start with struggle. Now, the Romans themselves weren't exactly modest about their origins. They didn't say, "Oh yes, we started out as farmers by a river." They told stories of gods and heroes, of twin brothers Romulus and Remus, abandoned at birth, left to die, and miraculously saved by a she-wolf who nursed them. Is it true? Probably not. But is it memorable? Absolutely. Because nothing says we're destined for greatness quite like being raised by a wolf. The legend continues. Romulus eventually kills his brother, classic sibling rivalry, taken up a notch, and names the new city after himself. Thus, Rome is born. It's the kind of myth that would make a Netflix producer drool. Violence, betrayal, divine intervention, and a dash of animal weirdness. And while modern historians roll their eyes, the Romans clung to it as proof that their city was no ordinary place. But here's the irony. For centuries after this supposed founding moment, Rome wasn't special, not even close. It was one of many little hilltop settlements in central Italy, overshadowed by the Etruscans to the north and the Greeks to the south. The Etruscans had actual cities with paved roads and drainage systems. The Greeks were founding colonies, trading wine and writing plays that people still pretend to understand today. Rome was basically the scrappy little brother no one took seriously. And yet, this is where the paradox begins. Because while Rome wasn't special in terms of resources or technology, it had something else, sheer stubborn determination, a knack for borrowing ideas from others, tweaking them, and then claiming them as their own. Think of them as the ancient world's greatest remix artists. They looked at Etruscan arches and said, "Yes, we'll take that." They looked at Greek gods and said, "We'll take those too, but we'll rename them and pretend they were ours all along." The early kings of Rome, because yes, Rome had kings before it had senators, were a mix of legend and reality. Names like Numa Pompilius, who supposedly introduced religion, or Tarquin the Proud, who was so arrogant he basically got himself overthrown. The kings laid the groundwork, but their downfall gave birth to something remarkable, the Roman Republic. Imagine it. Around 509 BCE, the Romans had had enough of monarchy. They threw out Tarquin the Proud after some very messy scandals and decided, no more kings. We'll govern ourselves, easier said than done, of course, because when you create a republic, you also create endless arguments, senators bickering in the forum, plebeians demanding rights, and constant debates over who really gets to call the shots. It was chaotic, it was messy, but it was also revolutionary. And slowly, painfully, Rome began to grow, not through brilliance, but through persistence. Wars with neighbors shaped their toughness. Victories gave them confidence. Defeats taught them lessons, often brutal ones. Bit by bit, Rome clawed its way from a muddy riverbank into a regional power. This is where the story really hooks you, because it's not just about the huts becoming houses or the forum replacing a patch of mud. It's about attitude. Rome shouldn't have survived, but it did. Rome shouldn't have expanded, but it did. And that underdog spirit, mixed with ruthlessness, would take them from fighting hill tribes to facing down Carthage, the great superpower of the Mediterranean. But we'll get to that. For now, let's linger in this early Rome, where myths blur with reality, and where a tiny village begins to dream of something far bigger than itself. So let's settle deeper into the story. If the first glimpse of Rome was a cluster of huts and a wolf mother nursing 2 abandoned infants, then the next chapters are pure legend, wrapped around a kernel of truth. And let's be clear, the Romans were fantastic storytellers. They didn't just record history, they embroidered it, gilded it, and handed it down like a bedtime story for adults. The myth of Romulus and Remus isn't just about wolves and fratricide. It's about identity. The Romans liked to believe that their founders were tough, abandoned, and raised in hardship. There's no soft, pampered childhood here, just survival against the odds. And honestly, that's very on brand for Rome. They wanted to imagine that from the very beginning, their people were hardened, destined for greatness because they had already faced death and clawed their way back. Romulus, after killing his brother, supposedly laid out the sacred boundary of the new city. He became its first king, giving his name to the settlement, Rome. And like so many leaders after him, Romulus established a pattern: violence and ambition, tempered by the idea that Rome was never just a place. It was an idea. Now, what about those kings who followed? This is where history starts to peek through the mist of myth. According to tradition, Rome had 7 kings before the Republic. Were there actually 7? Maybe, maybe not. Historians debate it, but what matters is what the Romans believed about these early rulers. Take Numa Pompilius, the second king. If Romulus was the violent founder, Numa was the wise lawgiver. He supposedly brought religion and ritual to Rome, giving the people festivals, priests, and temples. In other words, he made the city more than a military camp. He gave it a soul. Was Numa real? Hard to say, but the Romans believed he had spoken with the gods themselves, which, let's be honest, is a pretty unbeatable claim when you're trying to establish authority. Then there's Tullus Hostilius, who followed Numa. If Numa was about peace, Tullus was about war. He supposedly destroyed the neighboring city of Alba Longa and brought its people to Rome. You see the pattern? Rome grows not just by founding itself, but by swallowing others whole. One city becomes many. Servius Tullius is another figure worth mentioning. He's remembered for organizing Roman society into classes, not in the high school sense, but in the who owes what to the army and the state sense. Servius created a system where wealth determined your role in society and your duty to fight. And because this is Rome, fighting was always the priority. But the last king, Tarquin the Proud, was a cautionary tale. Arrogant, brutal, and despised, he ruled with cruelty until finally the Romans had had enough. His downfall, tied up with scandal and outrage, became the moment Rome swore off kings forever. No more monarchs, they said. And in 509 BCE, they established the Republic, a system that would last for centuries, at least until someone named Julius Caesar decided that maybe absolute power wasn't such a bad idea after all. Here's what's fascinating. These kings may be semi-mythical, but they reflect Rome's journey. Violence, law, war, organization, tyranny. Each one symbolizes a stage in the city's growth. And the Romans loved this pattern. It made their history feel inevitable, as if each king was a stepping stone leading toward destiny. Imagine yourself in early Rome during this time, the air thick with wood smoke, the hills dotted with farms, the chatter of Latin echoing in narrow lanes. You'd see priests carrying out rituals, families telling the stories of Romulus around hearth fires, and elders grumbling about the arrogance of kings. Life would be simple, harsh, and yet filled with this strange sense of purpose, as if the gods themselves were watching and measuring every step. And yet let's be clear, while Rome dressed its beginnings in myth, it was still a backwater. Nobody in Greece or Egypt cared about some tiny Latin village, and yet, step by step, Rome learned to fight, to organize, and to endure. Those early kings, real or not, were less important as historical figures, and more as a statement. Rome's story was always one of survival mixed with ambition, of myths used as scaffolding for power. By the time Tarquin was thrown out and the Republic established, Rome was ready for the next chapter, not just surviving, but expanding. And this, of course, would bring them into conflict with neighbors far stronger than themselves. But before we get to those wars, let's pause on this thought. Rome was born from myth, but it thrived on pragmatism. The wolf, the twins, the kings, they gave Rome a sense of destiny. But what really kept the city alive was stubbornness, adaptability, and a willingness to learn from others, even enemies. It's not a glamorous origin story, but it's a very Roman one. So Rome kicks out its last king, Tarquin the Proud, and swears off monarchy forever. Or at least that's the story they told themselves. No more crowns, no more royal palaces, no more kings lording over everyone. Instead, Rome would now be ruled by, well, a bunch of bickering aristocrats in togas, because nothing says freedom like swapping one tyrant for 100 smaller ones. Welcome to the Roman Republic, founded in 509 BCE. The Romans loved to boast about this system as if it were the pinnacle of political genius. In reality, it was messy, confusing, and fueled by grudges. But it worked somehow. And honestly, that contradiction, chaos that somehow produces stability, is one of the most Roman things imaginable. At the heart of the system were the consuls. Instead of one king, Rome now had 2 consuls elected every year, 2 men equal in power, each capable of vetoing the other. And if you're thinking, that sounds like a recipe for constant arguments, you're right. But that was the point. The Romans believed power had to be shared and checked, because otherwise someone would get ideas about being king again. Beneath the consuls sat the Senate, a body of wealthy aristocrats who claimed to represent wisdom and tradition. In practice, they represented their own interests, land, money, family prestige. But they gave Rome something valuable: continuity. Senators stayed in power long after consuls came and went, which meant Rome had a kind of institutional memory, even if it was a self-serving one. Then there were the assemblies where ordinary citizens, well, male citizens, could vote. But here's the catch. The voting system was rigged to favor the wealthy. The richer your class, the more your vote counted. Poor farmers technically had a voice, but let's be clear. It was like whispering in a thunderstorm. The rich shouted louder, and Rome pretended this was fair. Still, this early republic wasn't just aristocrats patting themselves on the back. There was constant tension between the patricians, the old noble families, and the plebeians, everyone else. The plebs demanded rights, and the patricians resisted, because sharing power is never popular when you already have it. Over time, the plebeians forced concessions, like the creation of the tribune of the plebs, officials whose entire job was to protect common people from aristocratic abuses. And the tribunes could even veto Senate decisions, which drove the elites absolutely insane. Imagine the atmosphere of early Rome during this time. The forum buzzing with arguments, citizens crowding around magistrates, the sound of hammers echoing from nearby workshops, goats wandering through the streets because Rome wasn't exactly glamorous yet. Politics wasn't some distant game. It was loud, public, and sometimes violent. If someone didn't like a law, they didn't just grumble. They marched, they protested, they threatened to leave the city entirely. The so-called conflict of the orders, the centuries-long struggle between patricians and plebeians, wasn't just about rights. It was about survival. And here's the genius of it. Rome kept adapting. Every time pressure built up too much, the Republic bent just enough not to break. More rights for plebeians, more offices created, more compromises reached. It was clunky and frustrating, but it gave Rome resilience. Instead of snapping in half, the system learned to flex. Of course, this doesn't mean early Rome was some democratic paradise. Far from it. Corruption was everywhere, bribery was normal, and political careers were often little more than springboards for personal glory. But the Romans believed in process, endless arguing, voting, and debating, and strangely enough, this gave them unity. Other cities in Italy tore themselves apart over kings and factions, but Rome, through sheer stubbornness, kept moving forward. And let's not forget the backdrop to all this political drama: war. Rome's republic was born in conflict. As soon as Tarquin was thrown out, his allies tried to put him back on the throne. Rome fought off invaders, held its ground against neighboring tribes, and slowly carved out dominance in central Italy. Politics and war went hand in hand. To be a successful Roman statesman, you also had to be a general. Sitting around making speeches wasn't enough. You had to prove yourself on the battlefield. This blending of politics and warfare became the Republic's defining trait. Ambition drove men to climb the political ladder, the cursus honorum, or course of honors. But each rung required military service, victories, or at least the illusion of them. Rome rewarded aggression, and the result was a society where politics was never just about laws or taxes. It was about power measured in soldiers, victories, and, of course, plunder. So picture it: the Republic in its infancy. Senators wrapped in white togas with purple stripes, plebeians arguing for more rights, consuls bickering like divorced parents, tribunes threatening to veto everything in sight. It's chaotic, exhausting, and oddly functional. Rome had discovered a system that balanced ambition with compromise, ego with structure, and this balance, precarious as it was, would allow them to survive the storms ahead. Because soon Rome would meet its greatest test, Carthage, a city across the sea, wealthy, powerful, and ready to fight, and in the wars that followed, Rome would transform from an Italian republic into the ruler of the Mediterranean. If Rome's early republic was about survival and compromise, then the Punic Wars were about ambition. And let's be clear, these wars were brutal, expensive, and dragged on for over a century. But they also turned Rome from a scrappy Italian power into the master of the Mediterranean. And at the center of it all was a rivalry with Carthage, a city that, at its height, looked like everything Rome was not. Carthage sat across the sea in North Africa near modern-day Tunisia, a Phoenician colony turned powerhouse. Carthage was wealthy, cosmopolitan, and dripping with trade goods. Think harbors packed with ships, warehouses overflowing with silver, ivory, and exotic animals, markets buzzing with languages from across the ancient world. Rome, by comparison, must have felt provincial. Carthage was rich, polished, and intimidating. Naturally, the two cities hated each other. The First Punic War kicked off in 264 BCE over Sicily, the island that sat like a cork between the two powers. Neither side could tolerate the other holding it. Rome, which wasn't exactly a naval powerhouse at the time, had to build a fleet from scratch. And because Rome was Rome, they turned it into a learning experience. They copied Carthaginian ship designs, added their own innovation, the corvus, a spiked boarding plank, and turned sea battles into land battles fought on wooden decks. Because if there was one thing Romans trusted, it was their infantry. The war was long, grinding, and costly, but Rome clawed out a victory. Carthage lost Sicily, then Sardinia and Corsica. Rome, for the first time, had overseas provinces, not bad for a city that once worried about goat raids. But the real drama came with the Second Punic War, which began in 218 BCE. Enter Hannibal Barca, Carthage's greatest general and Rome's worst nightmare. If you only remember one thing about the Punic Wars, it's probably Hannibal marching war elephants over the Alps. And yes, that actually happened. Picture it, an army slogging through freezing passes, snow falling, men slipping on icy rocks, and looming above it all, elephants, massive and bewildered, trudging where no elephant had any business being. It was equal parts terrifying and absurd. Hannibal's campaign in Italy was legendary. At battles like Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and especially Cannae, he humiliated Rome. At Cannae in 216 BCE, Hannibal pulled off one of the most famous military maneuvers in history. His smaller force encircled and annihilated a much larger Roman army, tens of thousands of Romans cut down in a single day. Imagine the shock in Rome. Senators pacing, citizens wailing, priests offering desperate sacrifices. It looked like the Republic was finished. But here's the thing about Rome. They didn't quit. Even after disasters that would have broken other states, Rome kept raising armies year after year. They refused to negotiate peace. And slowly, the tide turned. Hannibal rampaged across Italy for years, but could never crack the city of Rome itself. Eventually, Roman generals like Scipio Africanus carried the war to Carthage's doorstep. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, Hannibal was finally defeated. Carthage was forced to give up its empire, pay crushing reparations, and watch Rome rise. By this point, Rome wasn't just another Mediterranean player. Rome was the power. The wars had forged a new identity, aggressive, relentless, and destined to dominate. And yet, the irony is that Hannibal, in defeat, gave Rome its legend. To the Romans, He became the ultimate bogeyman, the enemy who proved their resilience. Parents even threatened children with his name, "Behave or Hannibal will come." That's how deep the scars went. The Third Punic War, years later, was almost anticlimactic. By then, Carthage was a shadow of its former self, but Rome wasn't about forgiveness. In 146 BCE, they besieged the city, destroyed it brick by brick, and supposedly salted the earth so nothing would grow again. Was the salt story true? Probably not, but it tells you how Rome wanted to be remembered: ruthless, uncompromising, and willing to erase rivals from the map. Picture Rome at the end of the Punic Wars, triumphal processions snaking through the city, generals parading captives and exotic animals, senators boasting about empire, merchants counting coins from new trade routes, common citizens awed by the sheer scale of Rome's victories. The Republic had transformed. It was no longer just a city-state. It was a Mediterranean superpower. And yet, with great power came new problems. Victory brought wealth, slaves, and land, but also greed, corruption, and inequality. Rome's next challenge wouldn't come from an enemy across the sea. It would come from within, as its own citizens struggled to handle the weight of empire. So here's the thing about victory. It always comes with a price tag. Rome may have walked away from the Punic Wars as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean, but the real transformation happened at home. The wars didn't just change Rome's geography. They rewired its society, its politics, and even its sense of identity. First, there was the wealth. Defeating Carthage and taking control of Sicily, Spain, and parts of North Africa meant new trade routes, new taxes, and new resources pouring into Rome. Silver from Spain, grain from Sicily, and slaves from everywhere Rome set foot. The markets of the city suddenly brimmed with foreign luxuries, fine wines, spices, silks, perfumes. Senators strutted in more expensive togas. Feasts became grander, and the divide between rich and poor widened like a crack splitting the forum itself. For ordinary Romans, the changes were more complicated. Thousands of small farmers had been drafted into the legions during the long wars, leaving their fields untended. Many came back to find their farms ruined, their land bought up by wealthy elites who turned the countryside into massive estates. Latifundia worked by slaves. Imagine fighting for years in Spain or Italy, surviving Hannibal's terror, only to return home and discover your land was gone and you were now competing with slave labor for a job. That's not exactly the homecoming anyone dreams of. The result? A swelling mass of poor citizens in Rome crammed into cheap, rickety apartments called insulae. Picture narrow stairways, smoky fires, chamber pots emptied into the streets below. It was noisy, dirty, and precarious. Rome's population ballooned, but its social fabric strained. Bread lines grew, street violence flared. The so-called glory of empire came with the reality that many Romans were worse off than before. Meanwhile, the Senate, supposed to be the guardian of the Republic, wasn't exactly handling victory with grace. The new provinces required governors, tax collectors, and administrators, and suddenly every senator's nephew was getting a cushy posting overseas. Corruption ran rampant. Tax farmers squeezed locals for all they were worth, sending fortunes back to Rome while building resentment abroad. For the first time, the Republic looked less like a noble experiment in shared government and more like a money machine run by the elite. And here's where it gets interesting. Rome's victories planted the seeds of Rome's decline. The very qualities that had helped the city rise, discipline, unity, the belief that everyone had to sacrifice for the Republic, began to erode. Citizens saw that wealth and power were becoming concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. The gap between patricians and plebeians wasn't just about status anymore, it was about survival. Culturally, Rome also shifted. With provinces came exposure to Greek philosophy, art, and religion. Roman aristocrats suddenly wanted statues of Zeus in their gardens, tutors from Athens for their children, and Greek words sprinkled into their Latin conversations to sound sophisticated. Imagine being a traditional Roman farmer watching your leaders swoon over Greek culture while your fields lay fallow. That tension between old Roman values and new cosmopolitan tastes would shape politics for centuries. But perhaps the most profound transformation was psychological. Rome now saw itself as destined to rule. Victory against Hannibal, who had once seemed unstoppable, convinced Romans that no enemy was too great, no obstacle too high. They began to believe not only in their superiority, but in their inevitability. And that sense of inevitability is both intoxicating and dangerous, because once you think you can't lose, you start making riskier bets. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, the Republic was not the same scrappy state that had faced down Carthage. It was wealthier, more powerful, and more confident, but also more unequal, more corrupt, and more fragile. Rome had become an empire in everything but name, and like all empires, the question was no longer if it would expand, but how far and how long it could hold itself together before the cracks grew too wide. Picture the city at dusk, senators in marble courtyards debating how to divide provinces, merchants tallying coins by lamplight, veterans leaning on crutches begging for bread, and children chasing each other through narrow alleys filled with the smell of smoke and stew. This was the Republic transformed, bigger, louder, richer, but also more unstable than ever. And with that, Rome was ready for its next chapter. The stage was set for gladiators, Caesars, and the slow unraveling of the Republic. But before we step into that world of marble facades and political backstabbing, let's pause. Because Chapter 2 isn't about survival anymore. It's about spectacle. It's about bread, circuses, and the men who thought they could bend Rome to their will. Chapter 2. Bread, circuses, and Caesars. Imagine walking into Rome at the height of its republican glory, not the fragile huts of its early days, not the scarred city staggering out of the Punic Wars, but a metropolis swelling with power and confidence. The Forum bustles like the beating heart of the world. Columns rise against the blue Italian sky. Senators wrapped in snow-white togas stride across marble courtyards, and foreign ambassadors crane their necks at temples glittering with spoils from every corner of the Mediterranean. It's noisy, crowded, and overwhelming in the way only a true capital of an empire in the making can be. Street vendors cry out for attention. Fresh bread, roasted chestnuts, honey cakes, dates from Carthage, and figs from Greece. Donkeys bray as they pull carts piled high with amphorae of olive oil or casks of Falernian wine. You'd smell the tang of garum, that infamous fermented fish sauce Romans poured on practically everything, mingling with wood smoke and the less romantic aroma of public latrines. Gladiatorial posters decorate the walls, painted announcements of who's fighting in the arena this week, a kind of ancient equivalent to boxing flyers. Children chase each other between stalls, while slaves carry water jars or balance trays of bread loaves on their heads. And everywhere, coins change hands, the clink of bronze, silver, and gold punctuating the city's rhythm like a constant heartbeat. This is the Rome that dazzles outsiders. To visiting provincials, it must have felt like stepping into another world, a city of wealth, spectacle, and endless activity. The aqueducts carried water across miles of countryside, their arches rising like stone skeletons over the hills. Public fountains gushed cool, fresh water in the city squares, an almost magical sight for someone who had grown up in a dusty village. And then there were the baths, vast complexes where citizens could strip away their tunics, gossip in the steam, swim in vast pools, and let warm water soothe the grime of daily life. Theatres also boomed, offering tragedies, comedies, and bawdy performances that made fun of politics. And politics themselves were a kind of public theatre. The open-air forum was not just a marketplace, but a stage where senators and populist firebrands performed speeches to win the favour of the crowd. Cicero would later perfect this art, but even in earlier days, Rome was a city where words were weapons, and applause could be as valuable as swords. And let's not forget the games: gladiators in the arena, chariot races in the Circus Maximus, animal hunts featuring lions, leopards, and even elephants imported from Africa. For the average Roman, these weren't just distractions, they were proof that Rome was powerful enough to command both nature and man for entertainment. Bread and circuses, the phrase goes, and here you see why. The state fed the people with free grain and then dazzled them with violent spectacle. Keep their stomachs full and their eyes entertained, and you kept them docile. But behind this glittering facade, cracks were already visible. The same games that enthralled the people also revealed Rome's appetite for excess. Gladiators lived in brutal training schools, often slaves or prisoners of war, forced to risk their lives for the crowd's cheers. Chariot drivers, adored like celebrities, faced daily danger with crashes that could shatter bodies and careers in an instant. And while the rich dined on roasted peacocks and mulsum, a honeyed wine, the poor survived on barley porridge and hoped the grain dole arrived on time. The glittering Rome of aqueducts and amphitheatres was real, but so was the struggle of those crammed into insulae, multi-story apartment blocks made of wood and brick, prone to collapse or burn down with frightening regularity. In one tenement, a family of 6 might live in a single smoky room, their lives far removed from the marble villas of the Palatine Hill. Still, this period felt like Rome's high tide, a time when the Republic seemed unstoppable. Wealth flowed in, monuments rose, and the city grew into a spectacle of grandeur and contradiction. From afar, it was breathtaking. Up close, it was messy, loud, and divided, but perhaps that's what made it so alive. By now, you can almost hear the mix, the creak of wagons, the cries of hawkers, the splash of fountains, and the roar of the crowd as horses thundered around the Circus Maximus. This was Rome at its peak, a city that glittered like gold, even if beneath the shine, its foundations were already beginning to shake. And soon those cracks would widen, because when wealth concentrates and spectacle becomes the glue holding a society together, politics turns from governance into rivalry, and one man, Julius Caesar, would ride those rivalries straight into legend. But before he arrives on the scene, let's take a closer look at the daily grind of life in this shimmering, chaotic Rome. Let's be clear. If you were lucky enough to be rich in Rome, life could feel like an endless banquet. And I don't mean that figuratively. The wealthy elites of the Republic and early empire made eating into performance art. Imagine reclining on a couch in a lavish triclinium, your sandals kicked off, propped on embroidered pillows while a slave gently wafts a fan to keep you cool. Bronze lamps cast a soft glow across painted walls. Murals of gods, heroes, and mythological monsters keeping silent watch over your dinner. The table before you groans with platters, roasted dormice rolled in honey and poppy seeds, flamingo tongues seasoned with garum, oysters fresh from the coast, and great haunches of venison dripping with fat. Servants bring dish after dish until the meal turns from indulgence into a test of endurance. Wine flows freely, cut with water but flavored with herbs, honey, or even seawater for the fashionable. Musicians play in the background while poets or philosophers are invited to share clever lines between courses. And if you think this sounds excessive, you're not wrong. Roman writers themselves poked fun at their society's gluttony. Satirists like Juvenal and Petronius wrote scenes mocking the absurd extravagance of banquets where hosts served silver-plated bread or peacock eggs stuffed with fish. Feasts became a way of showing off not just wealth but power, the ability to waste resources in the grandest way possible. The more ridiculous the spread, the greater the reputation of the host. But just beyond the villa walls, reality looked starkly different. The majority of Rome's population lived in insulae, those crowded apartment blocks stacked high like precarious towers. Picture a narrow room with one tiny window shared by parents, children, maybe a grandparent, and sometimes even another family. Dinner here wasn't roast peacock, it was barley porridge, beans, onions, and maybe a scrap of cheese if fortune smiled. Meat was a luxury, and bread was life itself. When grain shipments from Egypt or North Africa faltered, riots broke out. Hungry stomachs don't wait politely, and the grain dole became a lifeline for thousands. The divide between rich and poor wasn't just about food. It was about lifestyle. The wealthy could spend their afternoons at the baths or lounging at their estates outside the city, while the poor scraped by with long days hauling water, working in workshops, or selling small wares in markets. For the urban poor, every day carried risk. Fire sweeping through the wooden apartments, roofs collapsing, or the rent collector knocking at the door. Even so, both worlds coexisted in the same city. You might pass a senator's gilded carriage rolling down the street while barefoot children darted between its wheels. On the Aventine Hill, washerwomen scrubbed clothes in public basins, while a short walk away, the Palatine Hill glittered with frescoed palaces. Rome was a city of juxtapositions, splendor and squalor rubbing shoulders daily. And yet, despite the imbalance, there was an odd sense of shared rhythm. Rich or poor, Romans loved their entertainment. Both could sit in the Circus Maximus, side by side, roaring as horses thundered by. Both could watch gladiators in the Colosseum, though the rich did so from cushioned seats, while the poor stood under the blazing sun. In some ways, the spectacle acted as a great equalizer, blurring lines, at least for a few hours, between the haves and the have-nots. Still, the divide grew sharper over time. Senators grew rich on provincial taxes and land seized abroad. Merchants grew wealthy off trade routes spanning the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, small farmers, once the backbone of Roman society, were squeezed out, their fields swallowed by sprawling estates worked by slaves. These dispossessed farmers flooded into Rome, swelling the population of the poor, who became ever more dependent on free grain and state largesse. Imagine the tension. On one hand, feasts dripping with excess, honey cakes, roasted boar, and goblets of gold. On the other, insulae filled with families scraping by on lentils. Rome's greatness shone in its marble, its theaters, its games, but beneath it all, resentment simmered. The city's glory was real but fragile, built on inequality and an appetite for spectacle. And soon, those tensions would bleed into politics, because when bread and circuses weren't enough, ambitious men learned how to weaponize the crowd, and the most ambitious of them all, Julius Caesar, would step forward to seize it. Let's take a moment and set the stage. Rome in the 1st century BCE was, on the surface, glittering. The city had temples gleaming in white marble, aqueducts carrying fresh water across miles, markets spilling over with olives, spices, and wine. But under the polished facade, cracks widened. The Republic was straining at its seams. Senators bickered endlessly, ambitious generals tested limits, and the common people, well, they were restless, caught between poverty and promise. Here's the thing about Rome. It loved order, but it also loved chaos. The Senate prided itself on tradition, on checks and balances, on the idea that no one man could hold too much power. But at the same time, the Republic was producing larger-than-life figures who laughed at tradition. Men like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and finally Julius Caesar. Imagine a political system where every new strongman promises stability, then turns around and makes everything worse. Sound familiar? Caesar was different though, charismatic, calculating, and endlessly ambitious. He had that rare ability to be adored by the masses while feared by the elite. The senators saw him as dangerous, but the people saw him as theirs. He threw lavish games, secured grain, and forgave debts. While the Senate fretted, the crowd cheered. And of course, there was his military genius. Caesar spent years in Gaul, leading legions through forests, rivers, and mountains, conquering tribes, and writing his own commentaries about it all, always painting himself as the hero, the mastermind, the inevitable victor. His soldiers loved him because he marched beside them, slept on the ground with them, and rewarded them with spoils. For the people back in Rome, those victories meant gold, captives, and more reason to chant his name. But every victory abroad meant growing unease at home. Senators weren't blind. They saw how Caesar's fame eclipsed theirs. They saw his legions, men loyal to him, not to Rome, and when his term as governor ended, they wanted him to disband his army and return quietly as a private citizen. Caesar knew what that meant: humiliation, lawsuits, and probably exile. He wasn't about to hand over everything he had built. So came the moment everyone remembers, even if they don't know the details. Caesar at the Rubicon. Picture it, a cold January night in 49 BCE, Caesar on horseback, staring at the small river that marked the border of Italy. To cross with his army was to commit treason. To stay was to surrender. He muttered the words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast, and crossed. The Republic would never be the same again. Back in Rome, panic spread. Senators fled. Pompey, once Caesar's ally and now his rival, scrambled to raise an army. What followed was civil war, a bloody struggle not between foreign enemies but Romans against Romans, brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, loyalties ripped apart. But here's the irony. The Republic had been built to avoid kings, to avoid one man holding ultimate power. Yet the very system designed to preserve liberty had been hollowed out by greed, corruption, and ambition. Senators fought to protect their privileges, not the people. Generals fought for glory, not stability. And the people, they were caught in the middle, cheering for bread, circuses, and the strong man who seemed most likely to deliver. Julius Caesar didn't invent Rome's dysfunction. He simply exploited it brilliantly. And though his rise promised order, it also carried the seeds of dictatorship. The Republic was unraveling, thread by thread, toga by toga, until only the illusion of it remained. And soon, Caesar's story would collide with one of the most famous names in history, Cleopatra of Egypt, binding two worlds together in politics, power, and desire. Picture this: the marble streets of Rome buzzing with rumors, senators whispering in shaded porticos, merchants gossiping in marketplaces, citizens huddled over amphorae of wine in smoky taverns. And the subject on everyone's lips isn't just Caesar's victories or Pompey's defeat, it's Egypt, exotic, distant, dazzling Egypt. And at the center of it all, one woman, Cleopatra. Let's be clear, Cleopatra wasn't the Hollywood version. She wasn't simply a sultry seductress in a golden gown. She was far more dangerous than that. She was educated, shrewd, multilingual, and politically ruthless. In a world where women rarely held power openly, she ruled Egypt as pharaoh, balancing on the knife edge of Roman politics to keep her kingdom alive. To her, alliances weren't about love, they were about survival. The story of Cleopatra and Caesar is almost too perfect. After his victory in the Civil War, Caesar traveled to Egypt, and there he found not only a land of immense wealth, but a ruler who matched his ambition. Cleopatra knew how to make an entrance. Legend says she smuggled herself into his palace wrapped in a carpet, or more realistically, in a linen sack, only to be unrolled at his feet. Imagine the scene, a woman stepping out of cloth folds in the flicker of oil lamps, with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Was it love? Maybe. Was it politics? Absolutely. Egypt was rich with grain that could feed Rome's restless population, and Caesar was the most powerful man alive, though not yet crowned a king. Their relationship was a partnership, one that made sense for both of them. Cleopatra needed Roman backing against her rivals. Caesar needed Egypt's wealth and prestige. Together they were unstoppable. Of course, to Romans, this was scandalous. Caesar was already controversial for crossing the Rubicon and dismantling the Republic. Now he was entwined with a foreign queen, parading her through Rome and fathering a child with her, Caesarion. The Senate gritted its collective teeth. The people gawked. Some admired the romance. Others whispered that Caesar was turning into a king, complete with his own queen. Cleopatra herself was a master of image. She understood theatre. When she sailed up the Nile or appeared in ceremonies, she styled herself as the goddess Isis reborn. To the Egyptians, she was divine. To the Romans, she was dangerously captivating, too intelligent, too independent, too foreign. And yet Caesar could not resist her allure, political or otherwise. Their union represented more than just two individuals. It was the collision of two ancient worlds, Rome's rising empire and Egypt's fading but still magnificent kingdom. Rome was hungry, pragmatic, driven by conquest. Egypt was mystical, luxurious, steeped in gods and rituals thousands of years old. Together, they embodied both the promise and the peril of global power. But Rome wasn't built to share. Caesar's affair with Cleopatra only added to the Senate's fears that he wanted to crown himself king. And in Rome, king was the dirtiest word of all. The memory of Tarquin the Proud, the last monarch driven out centuries before, still haunted them. Caesar might have been adored by the masses, but his embrace of Cleopatra, his honors, his triumphs, all of it convinced the Senate that he was aiming for a crown. And we all know what happens next. A conspiracy would begin to form in shadowed corners, daggers sharpened, loyalty questioned. But for now, Caesar and Cleopatra stood at the height of their power, the world at their feet, their names whispered with awe and suspicion alike. Rome was dazzled, Rome was afraid, and Rome was about to spill blood on the Ides of March. Imagine the air in Rome in early March of 44 BCE, thick, uneasy, humming with tension. Caesar had returned from his conquests, richer than any man in living memory, more powerful than the Senate itself, adored by the people and feared by his rivals. He wore triumphal robes, accepted endless honors, and had himself declared dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. For his supporters, he was the savior of Rome. For his enemies, he was the death of the Republic. Now here's the irony. Caesar had promised stability. He had offered peace after decades of civil war, corruption, and chaos. Bread for the people, land for the soldiers, games in the amphitheater. He was delivering, sort of. But Rome wasn't built to be ruled by one man. The Senate could stomach strong generals. They could tolerate temporary dictators. But a permanent ruler, that felt like monarchy. And Rome had sworn off kings centuries before. So the whispers began. Senators like Brutus, Cassius, and others who styled themselves as the liberators plotted in shadows. They convinced themselves they weren't murderers, but restorers of freedom. They claimed they weren't striking down a man, they were saving Rome itself. Let's be clear, some truly believed this noble cause. Others were motivated by jealousy, ambition, or plain survival. Either way, they sharpened their daggers. On the Ides of March, Caesar walked into the Senate chamber at the theater of Pompey. The room, filled with marble and shadows, became a killing ground. One by one, the senators struck. Caesar, stunned, tried to fight, but the blades were too many. According to legend, when he saw Brutus among the attackers, he uttered those famous words, "Et tu, Brute," and then he fell at the feet of a statue of Pompey, his old rival. A neat touch of irony, if you're keeping score. Here's the kicker, though. The assassins thought the people would cheer. They thought Rome would celebrate freedom. Instead, the city erupted in chaos. Caesar wasn't just a dictator. He was beloved by the masses who had benefited from his reforms and dazzled by his victories. The senators had miscalculated. Rome didn't rejoice. Rome rioted. And into that chaos stepped two figures who would change everything, Mark Antony and Octavian. Antony was Caesar's loyal ally, a fiery speaker, and a man who knew how to turn grief into rage. At Caesar's funeral, he held up the blood-stained cloak, showed the wounds, and whipped the crowd into frenzy. The city turned against the conspirators, who were suddenly less liberators and more hunted men. Then there was Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir. He was young, barely 20, not yet impressive to look at, but behind those calm eyes was ambition colder than marble. He played the long game, aligning himself first with Antony and Lepidus to form the second triumvirate. Together, they hunted down the assassins. Brutus and Cassius met their end on battlefields in Greece, their dreams of a restored republic dying with them. But triumvirates don't last. Power is a dish too rich to share. Octavian and Antony soon turned on each other. Antony, entangled with Cleopatra, cast his lot with Egypt. Octavian positioned himself as the defender of Roman tradition against foreign influence. Propaganda flew across the empire. Antony the traitor, Cleopatra the seductress, Octavian the savior of Rome. The final showdown came at Actium in 31 BCE, a naval battle that decided the fate of the world. Octavian's fleet crushed Antony and Cleopatra. The lovers fled, only to end their lives in Egypt, their story immortalized in legend. Octavian returned to Rome not as a general, not as a consul, but as something new, Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. The Republic was dead, the Senate still met, the titles still existed, but the real power belonged to one man. Augustus was clever enough not to call himself king, but the truth was obvious. Rome had traded freedom for stability, and the empire was born. Chapter 3. The Empire at its height. Roads, legions, and gods. Picture Rome at the turn of the millennium around the year 27 BCE. Augustus, formerly Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, has secured his place as princeps, the first citizen. Not a king, not officially an emperor, at least not in name. He's smarter than that. Augustus knew Romans hated kings almost as much as they loved conquest, so he dressed his power in the old clothes of the Republic, insisting he was just another servant of the state. But let's be clear, he wasn't. Rome belonged to him, and everyone knew it. What Augustus promised was something Rome hadn't tasted in living memory: peace, real, prolonged peace. After a century of civil wars, betrayals, riots, and bloodshed, the people were exhausted. They didn't crave freedom. They craved stability, and Augustus delivered. He called it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Now, peace is a generous word here. The Pax Romana didn't mean no wars. It meant Rome wasn't fighting Rome. The legions still marched. Barbarians were still conquered. Revolts were still crushed. But within the empire, in the vast Mediterranean world now stitched together under Roman rule, there was relative calm. For 2 centuries, from Augustus to Marcus Aurelius, people could live and die without ever knowing the chaos their grandparents endured. Imagine the streets of Rome at the dawn of the Pax Romana. Wide stone roads stretched out from the city like veins, reaching to the corners of Europe, Africa, and Asia. Merchants walked these roads with donkeys loaded with amphorae of wine, jars of olive oil, baskets of grain. Soldiers marched them too, boots clattering in rhythm, their standards glinting in the sun. Cities blossomed under Roman order. Aqueducts carried clean water across miles, spilling into fountains and public baths. Amphitheaters filled with laughter and gasps as gladiators fought, not always to the death, but always for spectacle. Forums buzzed with debate and gossip, the air thick with incense, sweat, and the smell of roasting meat from street vendors. If you had money, life in Rome could feel like the pinnacle of human civilization. Of course, not everyone experienced this peace equally. The Pax Romana was built on conquest, slavery, and taxation. Roman roads were lined not just with milestones but with crucifixes, grim reminders of what happened to those who rebelled. And yet, for the ordinary Roman citizen, especially in the heart of the empire, it was easy to believe they were living in a golden age. Farmers could expect their fields to be safe from raids. Traders could travel from Spain to Syria under the same currency. Families could dream of stability in a world that had once been defined by chaos. It was an illusion, but a powerful one, and illusions are sometimes just as important as reality. The Pax Romana gave Rome something far more enduring than temporary calm. It gave it confidence, confidence that the empire was eternal, that Rome's order was natural, that the world was meant to be ruled from the banks of the Tiber. And so, under Augustus, marble replaced mud brick, chaos gave way to order, and the dream of Rome as an everlasting empire was born. It was never truly peace, not for the conquered, not for the enslaved, not for those under Rome's boot, but it was enough to convince Romans themselves that they were living in a timeless age of harmony. If the Pax Romana was Rome's promise, the roads were its proof. Rome was not just a city anymore. It was a system, an organism with arteries stretching thousands of miles, and those arteries were paved stone by stone with Roman ambition. Imagine yourself standing on one of these roads in the 1st century CE. It is not a dusty trail worn by feet and hooves, like most paths in the ancient world. It is straight, deliberate, engineered with obsessive precision. Beneath your sandals are layers, gravel, stones, sand, and finally large paving slabs locked together so tightly that weeds have little chance to sprout. On either side, drainage ditches keep the road from flooding. And every mile, literally every Roman mile, stands a milestone carved with the name of the emperor who funded the work, a subtle reminder of who made this world move. The Romans had a saying, all roads lead to Rome, and it wasn't a metaphor, it was cartographic truth. From Britannia's misty shores to Egypt's scorching deserts, from the vineyards of Gaul to the bazaars of Syria, roads converged like rivers back to the capital. The center of the world was not just political, it was geographical. Picture the traffic. Caravans of traders with wagons creaking under jars of wine, olive oil, spices, and glass. Legions marching in perfect rhythm, their shields catching the sun like a moving wall of bronze. Messengers on horseback racing between provinces, carrying orders sealed with imperial wax. Even humble peasants trudging with baskets of figs could move more safely and swiftly than their ancestors ever dreamed. Now let's be clear, the roads weren't built for convenience. They were built for control. Armies could move faster than rebellions. Governors could report back before conspiracies festered. Tax collectors could wring coins from distant provinces with ruthless efficiency. The roads made Rome not just powerful, but present everywhere. To live under Rome was to feel its reach in your bones, whether you lived in a marble villa or a mud brick hut. But the roads also created something Rome never intended, cultural fusion. Soldiers stationed in far-off lands brought home words, foods, and gods. Merchants spread not just goods but ideas, Greek philosophy, Egyptian cults, Gallic superstitions, all carried like pollen on the back of trade. Along the roads, Rome became less of a conqueror and more of a blender, absorbing the world and reshaping it into something that felt both foreign and Roman at once. And if you trace the ghost of these roads today, many are still there. Some are highways, some are quiet village lanes, but their stones whisper of a time when the empire wasn't just a political idea. It was carved into the very ground, mile after mile, until it felt eternal. The Pax Romana may have promised peace, but it was the roads that made that promise believable. They were Rome's greatest metaphor made real, an empire that claimed the world was one with itself at the center. If the Roman roads were the veins of empire, the legions were its beating heart. Nothing symbolized Rome more than the sight of a legion on the march, a column stretching for miles, shields glinting, standards swaying, and the steady rhythm of hobnailed sandals striking stone. It was the sound of order, discipline, and a promise. If you opposed Rome, these men would eventually arrive. A legion wasn't just an army, it was a machine of flesh and iron. Around 5,000 heavily armed soldiers, each drilled until their movements were less individual and more like gears in a clock. Every man carried a scutum, the large curved shield, a short stabbing sword called the gladius, and 2 javelins designed to bend on impact so they couldn't be hurled back. Add in helmets, armor, rations, and stakes for building fortifications, and each soldier was less a warrior and more a mobile fortress. Discipline was everything. Imagine yourself in a Roman training camp. The air smells of sweat, leather, and dust. Soldiers hack at wooden posts with swords twice as heavy as their real weapons, because if you could swing the practice blade, the real thing would feel like a feather. They march until their legs feel like stone. They dig ditches, build camps, and tear them down again, not because they need to, but because Rome drilled obedience until it was instinct. And let's be clear, the legionary life was not glamorous. Pay was modest, food was rough, salted pork, grain, sour wine, and disease claimed more lives than battle. A soldier could expect long years stationed in cold frontiers like Britannia or scorching deserts like Syria. Yet the legions kept loyalty because Rome offered something rare in the ancient world: stability, a pension, land after service, and the honor of citizenship for those who survived long enough. On the battlefield, the legions were terrifying not because they were the strongest men, but because they were the most organized. Where other armies charged in waves of chaos, Romans advanced like a wall. Shield locked to shield, spears thrusting forward, the line absorbing and pushing in disciplined rhythm, and if one man fell, another stepped forward. The machine kept moving. Enemies often broke not from wounds, but from the sheer psychological weight of fighting an army that acted like a single, unshakable body. But the legion wasn't just a force of destruction, it was also a force of construction. Soldiers doubled as engineers, building bridges, aqueducts, and fortifications wherever they went. Marching camps sprung up overnight, with trenches, walls, and gates so precise you could mistake them for permanent fortresses. The legions carried Rome not just in their swords, but in their shovels and hammers. Of course, the machine had its flaws. Mutinies broke out when pay was delayed. Generals sometimes used legions for personal ambition rather than Rome itself. Think of Caesar marching his men across the Rubicon. And foreign auxiliaries, though crucial, never quite held the same loyalty as native legionaries. But still, for centuries, the legions kept the empire stitched together, from the Sahara to the Rhine, from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. Imagine standing on a frontier wall, the wind cold, the horizon endless, and knowing that behind you lies Rome, the farms, the markets, the villas. The legion wasn't just an army, it was the embodiment of a promise that Rome would endure because men in armor stood watch at the edges of the world. If the legions kept Rome's body alive, religion was what tried to explain its soul. And in classic Roman fashion, the gods weren't so much worshipped with passion as they were managed like difficult clients. The Romans weren't really trying to love their gods, they were trying not to annoy them. Picture a Roman morning in the city. Before the sun has burned off the mist, smoke curls up from hundreds of little household shrines. Families toss grain, pour wine, or sacrifice a morsel of food to their lairs and penates, the spirits of home and pantry. Children grumble about chores, mothers grind grain into bread, but no one skips the ritual, because who wants to risk offending the forces that guard the front door? Rome was never picky about which gods it served. Conquer a new land, meet a new god, add them to the list. Egyptian Isis, sure, welcome aboard. Persian Mithras, come on in. Celtic deities with antlers, why not? The Roman pantheon was less like a sacred temple and more like a crowded tavern, noisy with deities elbowing for space. The big ones, of course, still mattered. Jupiter, king of the gods, glaring down from his temple on the Capitoline Hill. Mars, the red-faced god of war, always close to Roman hearts because, let's be clear, they fought more wars than they did harvest festivals. Venus, goddess of love, worshipped not just with flowers, but with plenty of irony given Rome's obsession with lust and politics. And then Saturn, whose festival, Saturnalia, basically turned Rome into a week-long carnival of reversed roles, drunken chaos, and gambling. Sound familiar? Yes, it's where Christmas traditions partly sneak their roots. But religion in Rome wasn't just about official gods. Strange cults wove through the city like secret currents. The cult of Mithras, popular with soldiers, held midnight ceremonies in underground chambers where initiates dined on sacrificial feasts and swore oaths under torchlight. To outsiders it looked shadowy, mysterious, maybe even dangerous. For the men inside, it was a brotherhood. Then there was Isis, imported from Egypt, whose worshippers paraded with music and incense, beating drums and shaking rattles through the streets of Rome. To conservative senators, it felt a little too foreign, too theatrical. To everyday Romans, though, Isis offered comfort, a goddess of protection, healing, and hope. And of course, one of the strangest cults to sprout in this fertile religious soil was Christianity. At first, just a small, often mocked sect of Jews whispering about a crucified carpenter who rose again. Most Romans barely noticed them at first. Why would they? In a city with hundreds of gods and cults, what was one more? But Christianity's insistence on one God and its refusal to bow to the emperor would one day shift the entire empire's foundation. Temples weren't just for prayer, they were community hubs. A ziggurat in Mesopotamia might have been the stairway to heaven, but in Rome, the temples were marble postcards of power. Walk into the Pantheon, with its dome and oculus staring up at the sky, and you didn't just feel small, you felt Rome's ambition written in stone. Religion was architecture, ritual, politics, and theater rolled into one. And yet, beneath all the pomp and sacrifice, most Romans weren't asking for transcendence. They weren't searching for spiritual enlightenment. They wanted their harvests safe, their children healthy, and their ships not sunk in storms. The gods were the managers of fortune, and Romans prayed with the same tone you'd use to bribe a customs officer, half respect, half anxiety. Imagine walking through Rome on a festival day. Torches crackle, animals bellow before sacrifice, musicians play reed pipes, and flower petals scatter underfoot. The air smells of roasting meat and incense. Crowds laugh, chant and cheer, all hoping the gods are paying attention, all trying to believe that divine order stands between them and chaos. The empire at its height wasn't just about swords and roads. It was about this constant hum of ritual, a civilization trying to negotiate with the unseen, layering fear and hope into every coin, prayer, and marble block. If you really want to understand Rome at its height, don't just look at the marble monuments or the gleaming legions. Look at the rhythms of daily life. The hum of people living, complaining, hustling, relaxing, and trying to make sense of their short time under the sun. Rome wasn't only the empire of Caesars. It was the empire of bakers, washerwomen, tavern keepers, children, and the countless anonymous souls who filled its crowded streets. Picture yourself wandering through a Roman city on an ordinary day. The sun is high. The streets noisy with carts rumbling over cobblestones, vendors hawking figs, olives, and warm loaves of bread. The air smells like a strange blend of roasting meat, crushed herbs, and, let's be honest, sewage. Not exactly perfume, but unmistakably Rome. At the heart of social life were the bathhouses. Forget the idea of a quick shower. Romans treated bathing like a whole day's event. You'd strip down, store your clothes, and drift from hot rooms to cold plunges, sweating out yesterday's wine in steam chambers while chatting with friends or rivals. Politicians schemed in the bars, poets recited verses, merchants sealed deals, and ordinary citizens just enjoyed the closest thing to affordable luxury. The baths were gossip hubs, relaxation centers, and in a way, the empire's great equalizers. A senator might recline beside a baker, and at least for an hour they shared the same hot water. When you stepped out of the baths, you might head to a tavern. Roman taverns, or popinae, weren't glamorous. Imagine dim, smoky rooms with cheap wine poured into clay cups, gambling dice clattering on the table, and the occasional brawl breaking out over an insult. These places were where sailors blew their pay, thieves swapped stories, and laborers forgot their troubles for a night. And yet, they were alive, places of laughter, song, and drunken boasts about fortunes that probably didn't exist. Food for most Romans was simple. Barley bread, lentils, olives, and maybe fish if you lived near the sea. Meat was rare for the poor but frequent at festivals. where sacrifices meant everyone got a taste of roasted lamb or ox. Meanwhile, the wealthy gorged themselves on banquets so extravagant they sounded like parody. Peacocks stuffed with other birds, dormice rolled in honey and poppy seeds, rivers of wine poured until guests literally fell asleep on couches. The irony, of course, was that while the poor starved in crowded tenements, the rich were throwing up between courses so they could keep eating. Children played games not so different from today, rolling hoops, tossing knucklebones, chasing each other in alleys. Some learned their letters by scratching wax tablets with a stylus, their hands cramped from repetition. Others were trained early in trades, weaving, smithing, farming. Girls prepared for marriage, often shockingly young, while boys were pushed towards soldiering, politics, or family businesses. Childhood in Rome was brief. Life hurried you into adulthood, and yet, despite the hardships, there was joy. Festivals filled the calendar, Saturnalia with its gift-giving and chaos, Lupercalia with its wild rituals, and countless local celebrations that gave people excuses to drink, feast, and forget their troubles. Imagine yourself lying back in a modest Roman home, oil lamp flickering, listening to the muffled sounds of the street outside, footsteps, a donkey braying, the faint laughter of neighbors. In that moment, you'd feel the rhythm of empire, not the thunder of legions, not the decrees of emperors, but the steady pulse of ordinary lives, lived one meal, one bath, one story at a time. That was Rome at its height, not just marble and conquest, but the small details, the scratch of a stylus, the steam of a bath, the warmth of bread, the laughter in a tavern. Together these moments stitch the empire into something human, something real. Chapter 4. Decline, Collapse, and Eternal Rome. Every empire likes to imagine it will last forever, Rome especially. After all, when you've paved roads across continents, built aqueducts that carry water for miles, and fielded armies so disciplined they can march in silence for days, it feels like you've hacked the cheat codes of history. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Nothing lasts forever. Not marble, not emperors, not even the empire that once called itself eternal. The cracks didn't start with a bang. They crept in slowly, like weeds between cobblestones. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the smooth surface of the Pax Romana was showing fractures. The economy faltered under the weight of endless wars and bureaucrats who seemed better at collecting bribes than taxes. Coins that had once been cold, heavy, and satisfyingly jangly began to feel suspiciously light in the hand. That's because emperors, desperate to pay armies and debts, started diluting the silver with cheaper metals. Inflation skyrocketed and markets groaned. A loaf of bread that once cost a handful of coins could suddenly devour an entire day's wages. Sound familiar? History loves to recycle its jokes. And then there were the plagues, not just one, but waves of them sweeping across the empire like invisible armies. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, cut down soldiers and civilians alike, emptying towns and leaving fields untended. Imagine walking through a once bustling street in Rome only to hear silence, doors shuttered, shops closed, the eerie absence of voices where there should have been laughter and argument. Disease wasn't just about death, it was about the hollowing out of confidence, the gnawing sense that the gods had turned their backs. Political stability, forget it. Emperors were dropping faster than bad emperors' statues. In just one chaotic stretch of the 3rd century, Rome saw more emperors than most people see shoes in their lifetime. Each new ruler promised strength and stability, but more often than not, they were assassinated by the same soldiers who put them on the throne. Rome became less of a state and more of a revolving door of men with delusions of grandeur and very short life expectancies. Meanwhile, the borders, Those endless frontiers guarded by forts and watchtowers were being tested. Germanic tribes pressed against the Rhine and Danube. Persians clawed at the eastern provinces. Rome's legions, once invincible, were stretched too thin, like butter scraped across too much bread. And in the cities, ordinary Romans felt the decline in ways that didn't always make headlines. Roads fell into disrepair. Grain shipments faltered, meaning bread was harder to come by. Public works crumbled without upkeep. That aqueduct delivering crisp, clean water to your town. Suddenly, it's dry, and the only replacement is a muddy stream down the road. The empire was still massive, still impressive from a distance, but up close, it was fraying. Imagine yourself in a Roman tavern during these years. The wine tastes weaker, the gossip is darker. People mutter about bandits on the roads, corrupt officials, barbarian raids. There's still laughter, still life, but the undercurrent has shifted. Rome no longer feels unshakable. It feels tired. The irony? The empire didn't collapse in one dramatic swoop. It was death by 1,000 small cuts. Economy, disease, corruption, invasion, none of these alone could topple the giant, but together they chipped away at Rome's foundation until the cracks spread too wide to ignore. This is where the long twilight begins. Not quite night, but the sun is setting, and even the proudest Romans could feel the shadows growing longer. When you think of Rome, you probably picture marble temples, stoic senators in togas, and maybe a few gladiators thrown in for good measure. But by the early 4th century, Rome was in the middle of an identity crisis. The empire was still enormous, still powerful on paper, but it was drifting, unsure of what exactly it stood for anymore. Enter Constantine, the man who would, quite literally, change Rome's religion and rewrite its legacy forever. Constantine's story begins, as these things often do, with ambition and blood. In the early 300s, Rome was divided between multiple emperors, each clinging to their slice of the empire in a desperate attempt to keep the chaos under control. It was called the Tetrarchy, and it was basically Rome's way of admitting, hey, this thing is too big for one guy to manage. Spoiler, it didn't work. Civil wars flared like brush fires. Emperors came and went, and the empire continued to wobble. Constantine clawed his way up through this mess with a mix of military victories and ruthless politics. But the moment that cemented his place in history wasn't just a battle. It was a vision. Before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, Constantine reportedly looked up at the sky and saw a symbol. Some say it was a cross, others describe it as the Chi Rho, the Greek letters for Christ. Alongside it, he claimed to see words that promised victory through this sign. Now, was it divine intervention, a clever bit of PR, or maybe a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and too much bad wine? We'll never know. But Constantine leaned into it, ordering his soldiers to march under Christian symbols. When he won the battle, he credited the Christian god for his victory, and just like that, the course of Western history swerved. Constantine wasn't the first emperor to flirt with Christianity, but he was the first to put real muscle behind it. In 313, he issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance to Christians who until then had been treated as suspicious troublemakers, sometimes even hunted down. Overnight, Christianity went from being an underground movement whispered in back rooms to something celebrated in basilicas. Picture the shift. For centuries, Roman religion had been a mix of old gods and borrowed ones. Jupiter thundering from the skies, Venus representing love, Mars standing for war. Temples dotted the landscape, priests burned incense, augurs read bird flights to interpret divine will, and then suddenly this strange, once persecuted faith centered on a crucified carpenter from Judea, was being funded, supported, and elevated by the emperor himself. Constantine didn't stop there. He sponsored church councils to settle theological disputes, gifted bishops with wealth and influence, and had Christian symbols stamped onto coins. He built churches that still stand today, like the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. If you were a Roman citizen living through this, it must have felt surreal. One decade you're sacrificing a bull to Jupiter, and the next you're watching your neighbors cross themselves and whisper prayers to Christ. Of course, Constantine was also pragmatic. He didn't ditch all the old gods overnight. He kept a toe in both camps. Even while backing Christianity, he still allowed traditional Roman cults to function. Some argue he was hedging his bets. Others say he genuinely believed. Maybe it was both. Either way, the effect was clear. Christianity was no longer just a sect. It was on its way to becoming Rome's defining religion. And here's the kicker. Constantine also shifted the empire's political center. In 330 CE, he founded a new capital, Constantinople, on the site of Byzantium in modern-day Turkey. Rome, the eternal city, was no longer the beating heart of the empire. Imagine the symbolism. The capital of the Roman Empire uprooted and replanted in the east, a city built to his specifications, glittering with palaces, walls, and Christian basilicas. For many Romans, this must have felt like both a betrayal and a new beginning. This pivot, both religious and political, reshaped Rome's destiny. Instead of fading quietly into the background, Christianity gave the empire a new identity, one that would outlive even the empire itself. Rome the city might crumble, but Rome the idea, carried on the shoulders of bishops, saints, and popes, would endure for millennia. Constantine's gamble worked. He gave Rome something new to cling to, but in doing so, he also revealed that the empire could change its very soul and still call itself Rome. That flexibility would keep it alive in the East for another 1,000 years. Rome loved to brag about its unity. One empire, one law, one set of roads running straight as an arrow to the eternal city. But by the late 3rd and 4th centuries, that unity was mostly a facade. The empire was simply too big, too unwieldy, and too battered by crises to function as one cohesive machine. So the great Roman solution: cut it in half. On paper, the split was supposed to be practical. Think of it like a giant company that grew so bloated it had to open a second headquarters. The empire was divided into an eastern half, centered on the gleaming new Constantinople, and a western half, still clinging to the old prestige of Rome itself. Each had its own emperor, its own armies, and its own bureaucrats. In theory, they'd cooperate. In reality, they became siblings constantly bickering over resources, prestige, and survival. The East had the advantage from the start. Its cities were richer, its trade routes more lucrative. Grain flowed from Egypt, silk and spices trickled in from Asia, and Constantinople sat like a jewel on the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Its walls, triple-layered and studded with towers, were a nightmare for any invader. The East could afford to weather storms. The West, not so lucky. Imagine trying to run an empire from Italy when your provinces are bleeding money, your farmland is exhausted, and your borders are swarming with restless tribes. The Western Empire had Rome, yes, but Rome by this point was more of a museum than a power center. The senators still paraded around in their togas, pretending their speeches mattered, but real power was slipping away, to generals, to barbarian warlords, to whoever could scrape together an army and pay it on time. The cultural divide widened too. In the West, Latin remained the lingua franca, But in the East, Greek was dominant, shaping philosophy, literature, and even religion. Western Romans clung to their old aristocratic traditions, while the East embraced a cosmopolitan mix of cultures, blending Roman order with Greek intellect and a dash of Eastern mysticism. One empire in name, but in spirit they were drifting apart. Religion added fuel to the split. Constantine's embrace of Christianity set off centuries of theological debates that often fell along east-west lines. Was Christ divine, human, or both? Should icons be worshipped or smashed? These weren't just abstract arguments. They became political weapons, pulling the two halves further apart. For ordinary people, the split wasn't some grand political drama. It was daily reality. In the East, life bustled in marble marketplaces, ships docking with goods from every corner of the known world. In the West, life was harder, more precarious. Roads fell into disrepair, villas crumbled, and the grandeur of Rome was increasingly a memory whispered over cheap wine in smoky taverns. And yet, here's the irony. The East and West both still called themselves Rome. They both claimed the same heritage, the same gods turned saints, the same right to call themselves the heirs of the eternal city. It was as if two people were trying to live in the same old house, one repainting it with fresh marble and mosaics, the other patching the roof with whatever scraps they could find. This split didn't immediately kill the West, but it did weaken it. Alone, the Western Empire found itself more exposed to invasions, more vulnerable to economic collapse, more dependent on mercenaries who weren't always loyal. Meanwhile, the East could stand taller, stronger, and richer, destined to outlive its sibling by 1,000 years. The division of the empire wasn't just a bureaucratic reform. It was the beginning of two very different destinies. The Eastern Empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, would shine with mosaics, domes, and emperors crowned in splendor. The Western Empire would stumble into decline, battered by pressures it could no longer withstand. And through it all, the myth of a united Rome lingered. Like an old song everyone remembered, but no one could quite sing the same way anymore. For centuries, Romans had boasted that their city was eternal. Armies could come and go, kingdoms could rise and fall, but Rome, the marble heart of the empire, would stand forever. That confidence became almost a superstition, a belief that the walls of Rome were untouchable, as though the gods themselves had set up an invisible shield. But superstition is a fragile thing, and in the 5th century, it shattered. The sackings of Rome weren't just military defeats, they were psychological earthquakes. Imagine living in a city that had once conquered the known world, only to see it overrun by outsiders, looted and humbled. To a Roman citizen, it must have felt like the world itself was ending. The first great breach came in 410 AD, when Alaric and his Visigoths stormed the city. Rome hadn't been sacked in nearly 800 years, so long that people had begun to believe it was impossible. But Alaric proved otherwise. His warriors surged through the gates, plundering wealth, burning houses, and terrifying citizens who had grown soft on memories of past glory. To the outside world, the message was clear. Rome was no longer invincible. And yet, life went on. The city recovered, bruised but still standing. Senators patched up their villas, markets reopened, and priests kept the rituals alive. The eternal city still clung to its dignity, though its grip was weakening. Then came the Vandals in 455 AD, led by their king, Genseric. If the Visigoths had bruised Rome, the Vandals left scars. They stripped the city of treasures, statues, gold, even sacred relics were hauled onto ships and carried across the sea. The word vandalize comes directly from this moment, a reminder of how brutal their plundering was. Rome's temples, once dazzling with offerings, looked gutted, and its citizens must have wondered whether the gods themselves had abandoned them. The humiliation wasn't over. In 546, the Ostrogothic king Totila swept into Rome during the long Gothic War. His soldiers desecrated what was left, torching buildings, scattering survivors, and turning once proud neighborhoods into ghostly ruins. And in 1527, long after the fall of the Western Empire, the city endured yet another infamous sack, this time by soldiers of the Holy Roman Empire. The irony was cruel. Even centuries later, Rome remained a prize worth plundering, a city that could not die, but also could not escape violation. What makes these sackings so haunting is the contrast. Imagine walking down streets where emperors once paraded in triumph, now filled with rubble, smoke, and desperate citizens clutching whatever they could carry. The colonnades and aqueducts still stood, silent witnesses to the collapse of order. The same stones that had echoed with cheers for gladiators now heard only the cries of the conquered. To the Romans of the time, it must have felt apocalyptic. The empire had been built on the idea that Rome itself was eternal, the anchor of the world. If even Rome could fall, what was left? Was there any order in the universe at all? But here's the strange truth. Rome didn't die in those sackings. The city was wounded, looted, humiliated, but it still stood. Its walls were repaired, its churches rebuilt, its people adapted. The empire may have collapsed, but the city lingered, a stubborn survivor that refused to vanish. The sackings were not the end of Rome. They were the end of Rome as it had been, a proud, domineering empire. What remained was something humbler, less powerful, but still alive, a reminder that even when empires collapse, cities, people, and stories endure in ways we don't expect. Rome is strange. It fell, and yet it didn't. The empire collapsed, emperors vanished, armies disbanded, but the city itself kept breathing, even if more raggedly than before. To call Rome dead is like declaring a tree gone just because it's shed its leaves. Rome didn't disappear. It transformed, shedding one identity and growing another. Think about it. The Western Roman Empire officially ended in 476 AD, when the boy emperor Romulus Augustus was quietly deposed. Hardly the thunderous collapse you'd expect for the greatest power on earth, just a forgotten teenager shown the door. And yet, the idea of Rome survived, lingering in law codes, in Latin, in architecture, in the imagination of everyone who came after. The Byzantines in Constantinople called themselves Romans for another 1,000 years. The Catholic Church claimed the legacy of Roman authority. Even medieval kings in Germany styled themselves Holy Roman Emperors, as if wearing the name could grant them the magic of the past. Walk through Rome today and you'll see why the idea never died. The Colosseum still looms, broken but unbowed. The Pantheon, with its massive dome, has survived empires, wars, and the slow grind of centuries. Cobbled streets still trace the paths where senators, soldiers, and slaves once walked. Rome is layered, a palimpsest of time where each age writes over the last, but never fully erases it. And perhaps that's why Rome feels eternal. Not because it was invincible, it wasn't, but because it was adaptable. Rome could be pagan or Christian, imperial or papal, glorious or ruinous, and still matter, still command awe, still remind us that power is fragile, but influence is stubborn. If you strip away the myths, what you find is both humbling and comforting. Rome was not made of marble, but of people, ordinary, messy, ambitious, fearful people who built something bigger than themselves. And though their empire fractured, the echoes of their work, their laws, their words, and their mistakes still hum beneath our feet. Every time we walk under an arch, sit in a senate, or complain about taxes, we're brushing against Rome's ghost. So as you settle into sleep, let Rome's story linger, not as a tale of triumph or tragedy, but as a reminder that nothing is ever truly gone. Cities fall, empires fade, but memory endures, reshaped and retold until it becomes part of us. Rome was never eternal in the way its emperors imagined, but in the way that stories outlive stone, in the way myths outlast armies. Yes, Rome is eternal, and tonight, as you close your eyes, you can let the weight of that eternity drift into dream. The aqueducts, the legions, the senators shouting in marble halls, they're gone, but the echo remains. Quiet now, fading into the night. Sleep well.